We're going to begin our discussion of antitrust by discussing mergers and acquisitions. So, what's the difference between mergers and acquisitions, which I'll abbreviate there. So, a corporate merger occurs when two formerly separate firms combine to become a single firm. When one firm purchases another, it's called an acquisition. So, in other words, you can have business A and business B, and they can merge to become a new business over here. That's a merger. On the other hand, you can have an acquisition, and in that case, you've got business A, and they buy business B, so they have acquired the other business. So when one firm purchases another, it's called an acquisition. An acquisition may not look just like a merger, since the newly purchased firm may continue to operate under its former company name. Mergers can also be lateral, when two firms of similar sizes combine to become one. However, both mergers and acquisitions lead to two formerly separate firms operating under common ownership. So they're commonly grouped together, and we just call it mergers and acquisitions. Since a merger combines two firms into one, it can reduce the extent of competition between firms. Therefore, when two U.S. firms announce a merger or acquisition, where at least one of the firms is above a minimum size of sales, and that threshold, it moves all the time. In 2015, if I can write here, in 2015, it was 76.3 million. So when they're going to combine, if it's above a minimum size, again in 2015 that size was 76.3 million, or certain other conditions are met, they're required under law to notify the U.S. Federal Trade Commission, which is also known as the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission. So if it, again, as of 2015, if the firm is over 76 point, if it's over 76.3 million, which is the threshold in terms of sales, they have to notify the FTC. The laws that give government the power to block certain mergers, and even some cases to break up large firms into smaller ones, are called antitrust laws. So that's a big topic for today. Antitrust laws. Before a large merger happens, the antitrust regulators at the FTC and also the U.S. Department of Justice can allow the merger. So they can allow it, prohibit it, or allow it given certain conditions. So there's one of three decisions that the Justice Department and the FTC may come to, and those three decisions are to allow the merger, prohibit the merger, or to place conditions upon the merger. So conditional. It could be conditional upon certain conditions being met. So there's three options there. One common condition is that the merger will be allowed if the firm agrees to sell off certain parts of the business. So that's common. They'll say, yes, you can merge, but you have to sell off certain parts of the business. The U.S. government approves most mergers. The fundamental belief behind a market-oriented economy is that firms, business firms, not governments, are in the best position to know if their actions will lead to attracting more customers or producing more efficiently. The challenge for the antitrust regulators at the FTC and the U.S. Department of Justice is to figure out when a merger is beneficial to consumers and when a merger may hinder competition. The nation's first antitrust law was the Sherman Antitrust Act, and that was in 1890. So our history of antitrust starts with the Sherman Antitrust Act, and that was in 1890. In an early demonstration of the law's power, the U.S. Supreme Court in 1911 upheld the government's right to break up Standard Oil, which had controlled about 90% of the country's oil refining, into 34 independent firms, including Exxon, Mobil, and Chevron. So, in 1911, under the Sherman Antitrust Act, Standard Oil, which was owned by J.D. Rockefeller. You've probably heard of John Rockefeller before. He owned Standard Oil. His company was broke up into business. It was into separate businesses. It was the Standard Oil Trust, and it was broken up into Exxon, Mobil, and Chevron. So why? Well, they controlled 90% of the market. And in that ruling, they came to the conclusion that they had, in fact, abused their market power. The Clayton Antitrust Act is the next one. So Clayton Antitrust Act, and that is in 1914. So the Clayton Antitrust Act, it outlawed mergers and acquisitions where the outcome would be to substantially lessen competition. So the wording of that, you can't do it if it's going to substantially lessen forgot my M, competition. So it's outlawed if it's going to substantially lessen competition. Fix this a little bit here. There we go. So Clayton Antitrust Act, 1914, and you can't merge if that merger is going to substantially lessen competition. So the what we're after is competition. So that Clayton Antitrust Act, it outlawed mergers and acquisitions where the outcomes would be to substantially lessen competition in an industry. Price discrimination, where different customers are charged different prices for the same product, so you can't engage in price discrimination. So everybody pays the same price. So why is that so important? Well, if you look at a demand curve, what you see is that different people are willing to pay different prices. Some people are willing to pay this price for that quantity. So this is price, this is quantity. So maybe business customers are willing to pay more than consumers maybe. And if you know who's willing to pay different amounts and you figure out a way to charge them that amount, you'll make more money, because normally you've got an equilibrium price. That's the price in the market right here. Equilibrium price, EQ. So normally that equilibrium price is the price for everybody. If you're able to engage in price discrimination, the producer surplus, if you could do it perfectly, the producer, instead of just this area being producer surplus, like you would normally see, this area is producer surplus. If the producer could perfectly price discriminate, they could also come up and capture this consumer surplus so that the producer gets all of the surplus value instead of it being shared with consumers. So this law wanted to see that didn't happen, that price discrimination. You can't price discriminate by charging different people different prices. You can't tie sales where purchases of one product commits the buyer to purchases of some other product. So the next act in 1914, the Federal Trade Commission was created to define more specifically what competition was unfair. So the Federal Trade Commission, there was also an act to start that in 1914. So 1914, an important year in terms of antitrust. So the Clayton Act and also the Federal Trade Commission founded through an act in 1914. So we're going to move on now and talk about some tools that have been used to identify how concentrated a firm is. An early tool for examining market power was the 4-firm concentration ratio. So 4-firm concentration ratio. So that was an early tool that was used. It's very easy to calculate. That's a good thing about it. So how do you calculate it? Well, let's say that you have company A, and company A has 20% of the market, and company B 17%, company C it's 13%, and say that company D has 10%. Okay, you may ask, what about the other firms in the market? You just ignore them. You're going to take the top 4 firms in the industry and you're going to add those together to have a 4-firm concentration ratio. So if you add 20, 17, 13, and 10, what do you get? I'm going to give you just a minute to calculate that. So you should have gotten 60%. So what's the 4-firm concentration ratio? Well, you add up 20, 17, 13, and 10, and you get 60%. That's the 4-firm concentration ratio. So although that 4-firm concentration ratio, it's simple to use, it had some shortcomings, and those shortcomings were an attempt to overcome those is to use what's called the Herfindahl-Hirschman index, which is abbreviated HHI. So Herfindahl, Herfindahl, Hirschman index. So Herfindahl and then Hirschman, Hirschn, Herfindahl Hirschman index, and we'll call that the HHI. So this Herfindahl Hirschman index, it was an attempt to overcome some shortcomings that were in the four-firm concentration ratio. And so the big question, how do you calculate the HHI? You sum the squares of the market share for each firm in the industry. So how's that work? Well, let's go back to our first example. So we've got companies, we've got A, B, C, and D. Company A, there was 20% market share. Company B is 17%. Then we've got 13% and 10%. So how do you do this? Well, Excel is great for this. If you were in Excel, you could set this up as column A, column B, column C over here. So it's the sum of the squares. So 20%, if you square 20, you get 400. If you square 17, you get 289. You get, if you square 13, you get 169. And if you square 10, of course, you get 100. So this number here, what is it? Well, it's 20% squared. So 20% squared. You square all of these. That's the process that moves you from column B over here to column C. You square those numbers. And what is this again? What are you trying to do? You're trying to get the sum, which means to add them up, the sum of the squares. So you square them and then you add them up, and then you get the sum of the squares. If you add these four numbers together, what you get is 958. So that's the HHI, the Herfindahl-Hirschman index for this particular firm's, this particular situation. It's going to be 958 is the index number. So let's, I'm going to give you a few more examples that you can think about, and you can probably come up with the answer pretty easy. So here's a question for you. What is the HHI for a monopoly? Well, this requires you to know the definition of a monopoly. So what is the definition of a monopoly? What's the market share for a monopoly? Well, it is 100%. So think about that. What is the HHI for a monopoly? So I'm going to give you just a second to think about that, remembering that the HHI, remembering that the definition of a monopoly is 100%. What are you trying to get with the HHI? Well, you're trying to get the sum of the squares. So give that some thought. This is a really easy one. Really, really easy. You don't even need a bunch of columns to add this up. So, do you have the answer? let me give you a little help here with the answer. The HHI is 100 squared, and that's equal to 10,000. So what's the most that the HHI might ever be? That would be another good exam question, wouldn't it? What's the highest that the HHI could be? Well, 100 squared, that's 10,000. So you can't get any more than 100% of the market. So 100 squared, that's one firm, a monopoly. That's your maximum HHI. And to give you another examples of kind of help you identify the range of numbers that the HHI might be, what is the HHI for 100 firms in a market, make up the total market? So you have an HHI for 100 firms, and again, that's the total market, that each have 1% of the market. They're all the same size. There's only 100 firms in the market, and they each have 1%. They're all just alike. They each have 1%. Well, think about that. It's another easy one. Technically, if you wanted to do every single little calculation, you'd have to set up rows and columns for this, but you should be able to think through it without doing that. So you could do firm 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and so on through 100 if you wanted to, but you shouldn't have to. How much is the market share for each one of them? Well, it is 1%. So what is 1 squared? 1 squared is 1 times 1, which is equal to 1. So the next firm, it's also 1 squared, 1 squared, 1 squared. You kind of see the point. This is all going to be 1 squared. And 1 squared is equal to 1. And if we do that 100 times and we add 1 together 100 times, what's our HHI going to be? Well, it's going to be 100. So the HHI there, in that case, 100 firms, each with 1% of the market, the HHI is going to be 100. So you can see we might have a wide range in values for the HHI up to a maximum HHI of 10,000, which is a monopoly. 100 squared is equal to 10,000. So those were tools that were used a lot in the past. In recent years, though, it's become a lot different because of globalization and some other issues. Things are just different now than they used to be. So one problem's just defining a market. We want to know the market share. Well, defining a market may sound easy, but defining a market is often controversial. For example, Microsoft in the early 2000s had a dominant share of the software for computer operating systems. However, in the total market for all computer software and services, including everything from games to scientific programs, the Microsoft share was only about 14% in 2014. A narrowly defined market will tend to make concentration appear higher, while a broadly defined market will tend to make it appear to be smaller. So the big question here is, how do you define the market? So if you're going to define the market, how do you define the market? You can if you define it narrowly, you get a high concentration. But on the other hand, if you define the market broadly, in the case of Microsoft, all software versus operating systems, on the narrow side, if you define it broadly, you can get a much lower concentration. So the big question, how are you going to define the market? Because that's really important. In recent decades, there's been two especially important shifts affecting how we define markets. One centers on technology, and the other centers on globalization. In addition, these two shifts are interconnected. With the vast improvement in communications technologies, including the development of the internet, a consumer can order books or pet supplies from all over the country or the world. As a result, the degree of competition many local retail businesses face has increased. The same effect may operate even more narrowly in markets for anywhere in the world, may operate more strongly in markets for business supplies where so-called business-to-business websites can allow buyers and suppliers from anywhere in the world to find each other in that business-to-business model. Globalization has changed the market boundaries. As recent as the 1970s, it was common for measurements of concentration ratios and HHIs to stop at national borders. But now many industries find their competition comes from the global market. So you may have heard of a book by Thomas Friedman, The World is Flat. So talks a lot about some of those issues. So how you define the market makes a lot of difference, and that's the beginning of our discussion of antitrust that started with mergers and acquisitions.